Welcome to the podcast, The Divine Will and the Church. As told in the Book of Heaven by Luisa Piccarretta, we'll be looking at excerpts in the 36 volumes of the Book of Heaven and excerpts that are specific to the Church. There will be 3 parts to these podcasts about the Church. And this is the first concerning what the Book of Heaven says about the Church. The second will be how the divine will builds up the Church. And the third will be prophetic insight into the future Church from the Book of Heaven. The first excerpt and a little explanation of the format is we do have the volume and the date, so these excerpts can be looked up in the Book of Heaven and viewed in context to the other excerpts surrounding it. The words that are in parentheses are my own words, and basically to distinguish and categorize the excerpts and to associate them with something occurring in the Church today. So the first one says, "And the more it seems that they favor my Church and sing hymns of victories and triumphs and practices of union between state and Church, the closer the brawl is which they are preparing against her." And it's something that we were always concerned about throughout the history of the Church, the influence of the state upon the Church. And the recent trend of globalism, as it is existing currently in, say, Europe in the form of the EU, or also globalism regarding other international states such as China and the United States, Canada, Mexico. There's, regarding any trade unification or currency unification, there will always be followed an associated requirement or associated interest in having the state also have some sort of control, greater control over the international body and the treaties that affect the finances between the states in that body. And because of that, there's also a trend for those powers to affect influence over the Church. And we've seen that in more severe circumstances in China, as an example, where the state basically would like to run and influence the Church in its totality. And we've seen that also previously in the Soviet Union as well. The next one is, and the one after that, is concerning the current state of the Church as it regards to persecution. And these excerpts and quotations that we're reviewing from the Book of Heaven regarding the Church, they're consistent with the statements of the saints regarding prophecies of the Church, and also with Marian apparitions concerning the same. So fundamentally, they do not paint a rosy picture about the Church. Proceeding with the next quote, "How many pretend to be my children while they are my fiercest enemies? How many false sons or usurpers, self-interested and unbelievers? Their hearts are like bilges of vice. These children will be the first to wage war against the Church. they will try to kill their own mother. Oh, how many of them are already about to come out in the field. Now there is war amongst governments. Soon they will make war against the church, and its greatest enemies will be its own children. So this touches upon a Bible quote that has been coming to my mind recently in St. Paul to the Thessalonians, chapter 2, 3rd verse, where he says that the day of the Lord will not come unless the apostasy comes first. And the apostasy, you cannot blame the outside factors such as the state, although persecution has definitely occurred externally as well. The persecution is also coming internally from people who have fallen from the faith, and they are attempting to align the church and divert it from its previous history and the deposit of faith that's handed down by the apostles to be in union with state governments more and more. And also they're losing the mind of the church, where they're beginning to view things materialistically rather than with any kind of sense of the supernatural. The next is from volume 30, and it's a very interesting analogy back to Jerusalem. These are actually in the same volume, same date, two quotations, and it's very wordy, but I recommend that you listen closely to this, and we'll review when I finish reading. Poor peoples, poor children of mine, under the regime of men without pity, without heart, without the grace to be able to act as guides for their subjects. Indeed, the epic of the Jewish people is being repeated, as they remained without a king when I was near to coming upon earth, and were under the dominion of an alien empire of barbarous and idolatrous men who did not even know their Creator. Yet this was a sign of my nearing coming into their midst. That epic and this one hold hands in many things, and the disappearance of thrones and empires is the announcement that the kingdom of my divine will is not far. It having to be a universal pacific kingdom, there will be no need of kings to dominate it. Each one will be king to himself. And continuing, my will be that for them law, guide, support, life, and absolute king of all, and of each one. And all the arbitrary and rightless leaders will be shattered like dust in the wind. The nations will continue to fight against one another, some by war, some by revolution, among themselves and against my church. They have a fire in their midst that devours them, that gives them no peace, and they can give no peace. It is the fire of sin and the fire of acting without God that gives them no peace. And they will never make peace if they do not call God into their midst as regime and bond of union and of peace. And I let them do, and I will make them touch with their own hands what it means to act without God. So going back to the first excerpt, the first line, there's a mention of guides. And going to the idea of this reflecting back to Jerusalem, where the church is being viewed as Jerusalem in the days of, as stated here, the Jewish people, and that their history in the church is being repeated. What that means is back then the Jews were under the Roman enslavement, and they did not have a king of their own. The king that they did have was a was a pawn of Rome, so not a true king. Also, the word guide, it goes back to the New Testament regarding Jesus's laments concerning the state of the Pharisees, calling them blind guides and white as sepulchres. If that is the analogy that's coming from here concerning our church today, it is definitely a very poor one and reflects very poorly upon our church today and its condition. But again, this is nothing that's not inconsistent with what we've heard in Marian prophecies from Akita, from Fatima, from Garabandal, from La Salette. Also, many saints have stated the same. Continuing on, this is concerning the falling away from the faith, the apostasy. And the next slide will have a similar theme as well. I am forced to allow that people go far away from my churches, from the sacraments, in order to prevent their contact from poisoning them more, making them more evil. My sorrow is great. The wounds of my heart are deep. Therefore pray, and united with those few good ones who are still around, compassionate my bitter sorrow. And the next slide. On my daughter, when I allow that churches remain deserted, ministers dispersed, masses reduced, it means that the sacrifices are offenses to me, that the prayers are insults, the adorations are reverences, the confessions amusements, and without fruit. Therefore no longer finding my glory but offenses, nor any good for them, making no use of them, I take them away. But this tearing ministers away from my sanctuary means that things have reached the ugliest point, and that the variety of scourges will multiply. How hard man is, how hard. And this is very ominous quotation, especially in light of the recent COVID-19 church closures, universal church closures. Whole countries have seen their churches shut down for long periods of time, without Mass, without sacraments. I suggest, in light of that, and you may be reading this sometime in the future, then recall these days of COVID-19 and the days when it was determined that masses were less important than liquor store purchases, which remained available, or going out to, say, in certain areas, going to the casinos, actually, which were one of the last institutions that closed. And moving on, the next one is, and the next two slides also are concerning the Immaculate Conception. And noted these were words given by Jesus to Luisa Piccarretta on December 8th, 1928, the feast day of the Immaculate Conception. And these are important because although they appear to pertain strictly to our mother, Mary, they, in a way, also provide insight into the church. My daughter, how content I am. Today it can be said that my sovereign Mama receives from the church the divine honors, as she honors in her as the first act of her life, the life of the divine will. These are the greatest honors that can be given, that the human will never have life in her, but always, always the divine will. This was the whole secret of her sanctity, of her height, power, beauty, greatness, and so on. It was my fiat that, with its heat, it extinguished the stain of original sin and conceived her immaculate and pure. So what's being said there is that the Church is honoring, with the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, the effect of the Immaculate Conception, but not its justification and cause, which was the divine will. And let's proceed to the next one, and I'll have a few other words to say about this. And my Church, instead of honoring my divine will's primary cause and prime act, honored the effects of it, and proclaimed her immaculate, conceived without sin. It can be said that the Church gave her human honors, not divine honors, which she justly deserves, because a divine will had continuous life in her. And this was a sorrow for me and for her, because neither did I receive from my Church the honors of a divine will dwelling in the Queen of Heaven, nor did she receive the honors due because she gave within herself the place in which to form the life of the supreme fiat, and the supreme fiat being the divine will provided to her by the Holy Trinity. And the reason why this is being said, to clarify, the divine will cannot exist with sin, the union of sin. So sin must, as the words here said, be erased or be extinguished, so that the divine will can dwell within our Blessed Mother Mary. And it is that divine will, the indwelling of it, that made her immaculate and conceived without sin. The next one is concerning a quotation around the universal prayer of the Church, the Our Father, and what has been hidden in the sight of many during the recitation of the Our Father regarding the divine will. It is true that the Church has been reciting the Our Father from the time I came upon earth, in which one asks, "Thy kingdom come, so that my will be done on earth as it is in heaven." But who thinks about the request they make? It can be said that the whole importance of such a request remained in my will, and that creatures recite it just to recite it, without understanding and without any interest in obtaining what they ask for. And many times in the New Testament you hear, "You have said it, but you did not understand." And we have been reciting the Our Father for many years without understanding its import. And the import is under the words, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." That is a prayer to bring down the divine will and have the will of the divinity reign upon the earth. But little have we really taken that into heart when we've said this prayer. I hope you join us for the second podcast, which will be concerning how the divine will builds up the Church. And you can see from some of these quotations that although I'm trying to organize it in a certain way, in certain categories, some quotations by their very nature will overlap these categories. And this is one of them, where this is actually a prayer that will actually build up and does build up the Church. So please join us for part 2 and also part 3, which will be prophetic statements from the Book of Heaven about the future of the Church. And also I suggest that and recommend to you some of the other people who have been conducting their own studies of the divine will. In particular, there's the Queen of Light Canticle and those, especially those YouTube podcasts that have been done by Father John Brown, and the Center for the Divine Will studies done by Thomas Fahey, and those can be found with YouTube searching for the title as it's stated right here. So if you'd like to write this down, please pause here and give yourself a chance to get a pen and paper. And the other one I'd recommend is the website for the queenofthedivinewill.org, which contains the Book of Heaven, which is downloadable. Again, thank you for joining.